Hello, I'm Dr. Yvette Rubidoux, and I'm the Director of the Policy Research Center at the National Congress of American Indians. Welcome to our NCAI Policy Research Center webinar series. Today we will focus on charting a path forward for responsible data sharing, and we'll discuss NIH's data management and sharing policy to begin the conversation on this topic in preparation for the upcoming NIH Tribal Consultation on this topic. This webinar features speakers from the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. We're so glad you joined us today and encourage you to watch for our webinar series. We try to hold them monthly, and they will focus on how data informs policy and feature a variety of topics and various guest speakers from time to time. I encourage you to join our listserv for announcements by emailing research@ncai.org. We also announce our webinars on Twitter and our website. If you've missed any of our webinars, the recordings are usually available on our NCAI YouTube page or on our website, ncai.org/PRC under Events and Webinars. So here's an overview of today's agenda. I just provided a welcome. And then Dr. David Wilson from the NIH Tribal Health Research Office will introduce the speakers today from the NIH Office of Extramural, or Office of Science Policy. Once the speakers are done with the presentation, we will reserve time for questions at the end. Before we get started, however, I'm going to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. So this is a depiction of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, and it is made up of two parts: the viewer window on the left, which displays the presentations, and the control panel on the right. I'll quickly navigate how to use the control panel so you can readily participate in today's web event. So by clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close your control panel. And here's where you will find all the information about your audio connection. We recommend dialing in via phone rather than the computer, as it tends to limit feedback. To dial in, you will find the number and the access code here, along with your unique audio PIN. As you can see, all attendees are currently muted in listen-only mode. At the end of the presentation, we will open up for Q&A, or questions and answers. And at this time, please submit your questions via writing them in the questions pane. And remember, today's webinar is being recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to a short evaluation, and the recording will be available soon on our NCAI YouTube page and our NCAI Policy Research Center website soon thereafter. And now I'm happy to introduce Dr. David Wilson, Director of the NIH Tribal Health Research Office, who will introduce the speaker today.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Rubidoux. And it's a pleasure to be here at the Embassy of Nations for this really important discussion around data sharing and data management. As you may know, that science and innovation is really moving towards the direction of big data, and this is due to extreme advances in technology and the complexity of the data that's being generated. So today we're going to begin to have an important discussion around how the NIH is developing policies with tribal input that would best serve tribal nations around the issue of how data is stored and managed. And to begin the conversation with us is the acting Chief of Staff for the NIH, and she's also the Director of the Office of Science Policy, Dr. Carrie Wolynets. But I also wanted to let everybody know that these are leading up to regional consultations that we are going to be holding on this specific topic, June 17th through the 21st in Sacramento, California, July 15th through the 19th in Washington, D.C., and July 29th through August 2nd in Denver, Colorado. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Wolynets.
Thank you, and thank you to the NCAI for giving us this opportunity to share some of our current thinking on where we're going with data sharing and management policy, and to begin to get some feedback from the community on our current thinking. So first slide, please. I thought it might be useful to start with some of the reasons that we think it's important to share the data that results from the research that NIH funds to improve human health. So the first reason why we think data sharing is important is because it really improves the quality and advancement of science. When data are transparent, it raises the bar for ensuring rigorous research because everybody can see it and sort of check up on your work to make sure that your experiments are done well and that they make sense. It maximizes the investment by reducing unnecessary duplication. So if there's a researcher who's thinking about going down a research direction, they can see that maybe someone has gone down that pathway before and seen that it's not in fact fruitful, and so they won't duplicate failed efforts. It also allows data to be combined in unconventional ways. So it allows you to take different types of data important to human health, maybe that is imaging data or data from diagnostic testing or genomic data, and put them together in a way that makes the data, the sum of the data, greater than its individual parts. Next slide, please. Data sharing is not just important for scientists, of course, it's also important for the public, which is particularly true for the National Institutes of Health, which is, of course, a publicly funded research agency. It helps hold publicly funded research accountable to the taxpayers through transparency and data sharing, which we believe helps build trust. Again, these feed into each other by ensuring that the science is of the highest quality and that the work that is being done is transparent. That contributes towards trust of the entire system. And it's important from a stewardship perspective too. Again, if we are not needlessly duplicating or continuously revalidating existing data, existing research, we can actually use our funds more wisely and invest in a greater number of research directions. The next slide, please. And finally, sharing data is important to the people who are participating in research. No longer would we have a case where access to the data is limited only to the individual scientists who generated that data and their sole perspective. This allows a more diverse viewpoint of different communities and different scientists to evaluate data and look at data from other perspectives or combine it with their own data sets, and allows research participants themselves to have access to data and see transparency around the data type. This allows a greater pool of members of society to contribute to improving health, which we think is incredibly important for the mission of the NIH. And then finally, it helps ensure that the participants who are volunteering of themselves, of their time, to participate in biomedical research are seeing sort of maximal utilization of their volunteerism, of their contributions, and ensures that there's greater representation in a wide array of research. Next slide, please. Now, data sharing is very easy to talk about in abstract, but operationalizing it is not free. Sometimes people talk about free access, and there's a lot of falsity in that statement because data sharing is neither free nor easy. From the researcher's point of view, data sharing can actually take a great deal of time and effort preparing data in ways that makes it shareable in useful ways. It's one thing to put your data into a PDF document or scribble it down on a piece of paper and put it up but to make it useful to other researchers and helpful to all of the people who want to see it, takes some amount of time, effort, and human resources. In addition, because different data types have different fabric of policies that are related to them. For example, data involving human participants has a lot of protections around it for identifiability reasons, for privacy reasons. We have to make sure that policies are coordinated. From the scientist point of view, there's not a lot of incentive or reward for data sharing. It's part of being sort of a good citizen of science, but you're not necessarily going to get additional awards or acknowledgments for doing that. There are proprietary interests at play from the people who generate the data or want to take advantage of sole access to the data, of course. And then at the end of the day, there's holding people accountable for our expectations in data sharing and compliance with policies, which takes a considerable amount of time and effort as well. Next slide. There are also some challenges, of course, from the participants' point of view. In particular, people who are involved in research and whose data we're talking about rightly want to know, how are my data protected? Who has access to that data? What kinds of control do I, as a research participant, have over that access? Can I be identified? Can someone figure out that those data belong to me? What happens if there is a security breach? What is the responsibility of the research enterprise to respond and mitigate against that risk? And can participating in research result in someone discriminating against me because they are misusing my data or abusing that access in some way? And so all of these challenges mean that it's incredibly important that as we move forward, we get this right and be very thoughtful about how do we overcome these challenges, how do we put appropriate guardrails around the expectations and policies that we put into place that will help alleviate some of the anxiety that these challenges cause for both scientists and research participants. Next. In short, what's the best path forward to advance science while maintaining public trust in the research enterprise? Next. So just to give a little background on our path thus far, in 2015, NIH released a plan related to access to the results of federally funded research. This looked at both publication access as well as data access, and was really part of a broader government effort towards open science and broader access to the results of federally funded research. And in that plan, we announced our intentions to update our policy on management and sharing of research data from the agency. In 2016, we put out an RFI that began to share some of our thinking on the who, what, when, where, and whys of data management and sharing, and begin to get some input from the community on that thinking. We refined that a little bit more and put out another RFI, request for information, in 2018, in which we took the input from the previous RFIs and generated some proposed provisions. So this was almost a straw man policy of these are some of the things we're thinking about, some of the options we're considering, and asked for input from the community on those. And that include definitions of scope and elements. You know, what do we mean by data? What do we mean by sharing? Some idea of the types of expectations and requirements we might have put in place for data management and sharing, and where we might need exceptions for the expectation or requirement for data sharing. When are those scenarios where it might, in fact, not be appropriate for any variety of reasons to share data, or perhaps to have more restricted access to data? Next. One of the things that, in talking about our data sharing and management policy, that I've come to realize is that it's really important to conceptually describe what it is that we're talking about. I think it's very easy when you think about a data sharing policy to think that it's going to look something like NIH requires all data to be shared, and we want it to put in, you know, this database, and there's going to be these rules around access, and I think it's very easy to imagine a very prescriptive policy. The direction we're heading in actually is really a far more flexible framework. Essentially, we're going to be asking our investigators to give us a plan about how they, as the researchers, are going to manage and share their data, to consider the feasibility of how they're going to share their data, and include in that plan how or why data may or may not be shared. This really sets a floor for good practice upon which particular data types or particular areas of research might want to build additional requirements or additional expectations. But as an agency, really, we're leaving a lot of flexibility in the hands of the researchers who know the data best to describe what is the best and most appropriate way to manage and share that data. And this allows us to accommodate the diversity of data types that are supported by NIH, because of course, we have a very large budget. We support a wide array of different research directions. And so it's very hard to come up with a one-size-fits-all data policy that doesn't allow a great deal of flexibility. And we want to make sure that when we put out our policy to ask for this plan, that we are not leaving a lot of open-ended questions in the air. The devil is always in the detail of policies, and we want to make sure that we are putting out guidance related to implementation, sort of hand in glove with the policy, so that everyone can really see how this might work in the real world. And of course, we expect that over time, guidance will evolve as science advances, as we begin to get experience with how this is working. Next. So what happens next? We're going to continue to seek input from stakeholders through opportunities such as this. So we want to hear from you, and we're trying to do a lot of outreach and begin to get everybody thinking about where we are and what they would like to see in a data sharing policy. We are in the process of developing a draft policy, and I hope to release it within the next year or so, and any associated guidance, and that's little g guidance, because of course guidance is really more in the form of best practices of what implementation of a policy might look like. And then once we put that out, we're going to come back and say, well, now we've put all our cards on the table. Tell us what you think about it. So that will be another opportunity for communities to provide input to the agency on the policy itself. And then we'll incorporate all of that feedback we receive and ultimately release a final policy for data sharing and management. So next slide. Let me just conclude by saying that, again, we appreciate this opportunity, hopefully the first of many, to have this conversation with the tribal nations. We're committed to working with the tribal nations as we move forward and think about what directions we're going to go in with data sharing and management. We continue to aim to support research in ways that reflect the tribal nations' priorities and values. And we really do value your input and want to hear from you. And so, again, grateful for the opportunity to kick off the conversation, and happy to take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much for that overview of the issue. And we're going to take questions in a minute. And so for the attendees, please submit your questions via the questions pane. And we'll try to get to as many of them as possible before the end of the webinar. And so this is, the purpose of this webinar was to give an opportunity to discuss and get some advanced information on the topic. And then the actual consultation sessions are happening as as indicated in that letter, right? I just want to check with Dr. Wilson and see if you want to add any comments before we go to the questions.
No, I think that the agency as a whole has been very responsive to reaching out to tribal nations and communities and Native research, the Native research community, to get their input to shape policies. And we've been working in concert with the agencies across the agency. OSP has been extremely helpful and responsible in partnering with us to get out these policies ahead of time. I know that in the past, I think a lot of policies we've been responding to them reactively after they have been rolled out, and that's been a challenge. But now we're doing this on the front end, which I think will make things a lot easier for all sides of this incorporated, and it will make the policy stronger, not just for Native communities, but for other communities that have had challenges with research in the past. So we're really excited about NCAI being a partner in this together, and we're looking, we'll hopefully have monthly NCAI engagements where we bring new topics to the table. But until then, we're really happy to be here.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions. Someone wanted you to, again, clarify the dates and locations of the consultation sessions.
Great, absolutely. Happy to do that. So we're starting off with the June 17th through the 21st of 2019 in Sacramento, California. These are part of the HHS regional consultations. So this would be covering Region 9. And then after that would be July 15th through the 19th in Washington, D.C., and that would cover Regions 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then July 29th through August 2nd, which will be in Denver, Colorado, and that would cover Regions 6, 7, and 8.
Great, thank you. And we have another question. At what point was the tribal consultation initiated in the NIH plan for data sharing?
Well, I think that what we're talking about now is this is sort of the initiation. The original plan, the plan that was came out in 2015, essentially just stated publicly, we're planning to move in this direction. It did not actually reveal anything about the policy itself. It was not in and of itself a policy. So it's just sort of notice to the world that NIH was interested in moving in this direction. And since then, we've really have been focused on outreach and talking to the various communities. We recognize that everything that NIH does at the end of the day is essentially generating data. So a policy related to management and sharing of data has quite broad implications for everything the agency does. And so we want to make sure that we are being very thoughtful and deliberative as we move forward because this has such widespread implications for the agency.
Great, thank you. The next question is, has a meta-analysis been done to identify best practices and protocols for use of data from data sets that can be sorted by, for example, race?
The simple answer to that is I don't know. I know there have been some research publications related to that, but I don't know. Certainly NIH has not done anything like that, but I would have to look at some of the broader efforts going on kind of across the government in the open science space where something like that either may have been thought about, done, or is planned for the future.
Okay, thank you. And there was another question is, there was a recent request for information or RFI that asked for specific questions about data management. Can you give us an update on the input that's been received?
Yes, so all of the comments for that RFI are now publicly available on our website, and we are very much incorporating what we heard in that RFI into our current thinking and drafting of policy, which, as I mentioned, we're hoping to share by the end of the year. We did get a number of respondents from tribal communities. We had at least 6 responses from organizations representing tribal communities. So that was very helpful to shape our thinking specific to the tribal perspective on data sharing and management.
All right, thank you. Another question, actually, Chairman Aaron Payment, the chair of the NIH TAC, is on the line. And he is saying, access to the NCES, National Center for Education Statistics, is restricted to select certified investigators who are trained in the ethical use of data. This is done to minimize popular or mass use of data with spurious conclusions. There is a sensitivity to the results from precision medicine data, as there are likely to shortage of groups who will want to conduct genetic predispositions to certain outcomes. In other words, why bother to fashion interventions if it is inevitable that a certain population is genetically predisposed? Worse, spurious results concluding genetic inferiority may be concluded by unethical researchers with a nationalist agenda. And so I guess the question is, how would NIH prevent from
Thank you for the question. A couple of thoughts. One is, it's important to recognize that not all data are the same, and that when we describe our policy as a floor upon which further requirements might be built, that includes appropriate requirements for the responsible use of specific data types. So if you think about very complex data sets that involve, for example, healthcare data or genomic data that might have specific sensitivities or a higher degree of risk for identifiability or misuse in any way, you're going to want to put potentially further protections or access or restrictions on the use of those particular data types. Other data, for example, you're generating data about fruit flies, there might be no need for that sort of protection because you could have greater transparency. We need to be very, I think, respectful and responsible around the data types that present the most concern for participants, for particular communities, and then build in the appropriate protections for those particular data types.
Thank you. The next question is, there's 2 parts to it. So the first part is, what will occur if the tribal leaders do not want data to be shared? And I'm adding into that, the new update to the Common Rule allows tribes to pass their own research laws and codes, and that may include that they have restrictions on data sharing. So again, the question is, what will occur if the tribal leaders do not want data to be shared?
So again, the direction our data sharing and management policy is going is to ask researchers to submit a plan for how they're going to share and manage their data. In a case where there is, for example, a tribal law or policy that would not allow data sharing, or if there is a pre-existing data access agreement involving a tribal nation, then the investigator might say in their plan, this circumstance does not allow me to share this data, or it only allows me to share this data under these particular conditions. And that would be part of the plan. And that is why we think it's important to have that flexibility to allow for particular data types, particular circumstances where it might not be appropriate to share data. And then I think the onus is on the research community to continue to build trust with tribal nations to get to a point where tribal communities feel comfortable to the point that data sharing and management allows those communities to benefit from the medical research and data sharing overall. I think that it needs to be a continuing and ongoing conversation. But in terms of the policy itself, we hope that it will have the flexibility to allow for specific circumstances that might be relevant to tribal nations.
So what kind of protections, this is the next question, can be put in place in case an investigator writes a data management plan in their proposal that does not include the tribal preferences or laws? Like either they don't know about them or they're just ignoring them. What kind of protections can be put in place to prevent that?
That's a great question. So, you know, as a federal funding agency, we have essentially carrots and sticks in the form of the guidance we put in place, the rules that we expect people to follow, which become terms and conditions of their award. And if they don't follow those rules, we take their money away. And so there are serious consequences to those. That is not helpful if there's already been a violation of trust. You know, that might not be a satisfying, you know, sort of recourse. I think one of the things that it would be very useful for us to hear about as we develop the guidance around this data sharing policy is how we can, in advance, mitigate that risk. What are some of the things we can do, whether working with THRO, whether working with the tribal nations, to make sure that certainly that mistake is not made out of ignorance, that our investigators are fully cognizant of all of the relevant tribal laws and policies and have access to the resources to educate themselves about that, but also to make sure that institutional review boards who have the regulatory authority to make sure that that research involving participants follows relevant laws, policies, that our reviewers are aware of this, so that the entire system has sensitivity to that and can sort of be on the lookout to make sure that nothing untoward happens.
That was another question. How are you going to train the reviewers to make sure that they are aware of tribal codes and laws and the need for the investigator to follow what the tribes are saying about how they may or may not want data to be shared?
Great, thank you for that question. Well, the Tribal Health Research Office has been working a lot with the Center for Scientific Review on exactly how we can approach this issue and better educate the reviewers on some of the specifics around reviewing AIN research grants. And one of the things that we were thinking about is how we might incorporate some guidance on the programmatic side. So the Center for Scientific Review reviews the scientific merit of each proposal, but it ultimately goes back to the program offices to implement these grants. So having those guidelines and restrictions within the programmatic area, where it would be up to the program officer to adhere to and enforce those guidelines, are looking like probably one of the best solutions moving forward.
Great, thank you. So that's the similar question, but asked in a different way. What will occur if the tribal leaders do not want data to be shared, but individual members of the tribe do want their data shared? How would you handle that?
I may have to defer to my colleagues who are more expert in the relationship between individuals and their tribal governance structures, because I don't want to misstep inappropriately. I think this is an area where I have a lot to learn in ways that will help us build a better policy.
All right, I guess that means me. So it's really important for us to respect tribal sovereignty. And as sovereign nations, what we would do is follow and adhere to the laws and policies that are established by the nation. So if they determine that they do not want data shared, then we would follow that, respecting tribal sovereignty. And it would be up to the individual to communicate to their government about corrective course of action. So that would have to happen internally. But we would follow the policies that are enforced by the tribal government.
Thank you. The next question is, would NIH agree to tribal approval before any release of data which involves tribal communities and people?
I can't, in the same way that I can't imagine a one-size-fits-all data policy because of the sort of diversity of different research that NIH funds, it is hard to imagine a one-size-fits-all agreement of that sort. I think there is going to have to be, as we have seen already with, for example, the ECHO program, some case by case, project by project basis evaluation of what's appropriate in terms of data sharing.
Let me add to that. It is very much a case by case situation and scenario. Take, for example, the All of Us research program. They have an early release of a data browser that would allow people to begin to navigate their system to see what the tools are available and how to manipulate the data as it currently exists. Well, our Tribal Advisory Committee was very concerned about this, and they wanted to make sure that tribes were involved in the process about how the data was shared and make sure that everything was in place to protect the participants who have already enrolled. And hearing this call, the leadership from the All of Us program has restricted the access of American Indian and Alaskan Native information until we've gone through proper consultation with tribal nations and everything is laid out in a way that is satisfactory to the communities. And then I believe that information will be accessible under the right conditions and terms.
Thank you. The next question is, in gaining IRB approval to conduct research, a test is done to determine the threat to vulnerable populations. But what protections will exist to prevent disaggregation of the data set to identify specific tribal results? For example, Navajo zip codes will make it obvious that it's data from Navajo, and thereby disaggregating the data exposes their results that they may not have wanted to be public. So I guess it's what could be done in the policy to help with that.
Well, I would emphasize again that the policy itself is not going to get down to that granular level of detail. Associated guidance, where appropriate, might to talk about what are the best practices, what are the expectations to ensure prevention of what is essentially de-identification of individuals or communities or vulnerable populations within data sets. And that is a shared responsibility, of course, of the investigator, the agency, and the regulatory system, the Institutional Review Board, for example. And so that will probably not be part of the policy itself, but certainly could shape some of the guidance related to the overall policy.
So I just also want to clarify what you said today is that there's been a lot of input and thought in NIH, but there's no policy yet and no guidance yet? Or? No,
that's right. So again, we are moving very slowly and deliberately because this is such a big deal policy, and we know it raises sensitivities and concerns not only among tribal nations, but other populations, amongst researchers themselves. I think that this is, as I said, a policy with broad implications. And so our plan is to release draft policy and draft guidance by the end of this year for additional inputs. And then that input will be incorporated, and ultimately the policy will be finalized based on that input, assuming that the input is not so discordant that we feel we need to revisit parts of the policy. But there is no policy or guidance in place now. We are very much in the we need and want your feedback stage. So even these questions are actually very helpful for shaping our thinking about some of the things we might need to incorporate into guidance.
So in that case, these consultation sessions are really important because they could influence the outcome?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, can we see some clearance process similar to IRB approval at NIH that proves that the concerns that tribes have were considered and the risk is minimized to human subjects when data is shared?
Well, I can answer the first part of that, which is listening and hearing tribal concerns and needs. When the information that we get from each of these consultations will be posted on the Tribal Health Research Office website, and how they're responded to, or if any action was taken to address them, will be posted there, so that all the comments that we receive will be addressed, and you'll be able to see that in the public space. The second part of the question, can you repeat that again?
So I think it's asking, can NIH have some kind of clearance process similar to IRB approval once the policy is in place that proves that concerns about harm to tribes are considered and that risk is minimized to human subjects when data is shared?
So we need to be careful not to, so the regulatory authority for protection of human research participants is with the Office of Human Research Protections, which of course is the regulatory agency from which the IRB system comes. So we have to be very careful not to duplicate or overrule the regulatory authority of the IRBs, essentially. But one of the things to be keeping in mind is that we are giving a lot of thought and would appreciate feedback on whether or not the plans for data sharing should be made public. And that would be another way for there to be transparency around data sharing that would allow input to be, before the data is shared, before the data is collected, an opportunity for people to see that. And I think we can also encourage potentially as part of the guidance here, the role that tribal IRBs might play, who will have, of course, that specific sensitivity in mind and a lot of experience in navigating these kinds of issues.
Well, that makes sense because actually research with tribes and data has to go through their research review, and hopefully the review process there will help. But also saying that OHRP has a role in this, they have made a huge role by putting that researchers with federal funding have to follow the common rule in federally funded research. And so their data management plan would have to follow tribal laws as well. So I think for Indian country, we need to make sure all tribes get research codes in place. And a lot of tribes do have their research codes published on their IRB websites and research review websites. All right, the next question is, who do you want at the table during the consultation in addition to the actual tribal leadership? And would it help to have IRB or Research Review Board administrators and tribal data coordinators in the conversation?
So this is, our consultations follow the standard HHS protocol, which requires elected tribal leaders to be allowed to respond first, and then it would go down in ranking order depending upon their affiliation with the tribe. And so we encourage tribal IRB officials or healthcare professionals to consult with their tribal leadership so that they can convey those sentiments or those thoughts during the consultation, and they can be expressed through the elected tribal leadership. So that's the best way to maintain and respect the consultation process.
Can, let's say you're the IRB or Research Review Board coordinator at a tribe, and you know that your tribal, tribal leader can't make it, but you might be there and want to participate. If you brought a letter from the tribe designating you as their representative in that consultation, could you then speak?
Absolutely. That would be a great mechanism to have somebody there at the table. We want to have as many diverse communities represented as possible. Also, another mechanism that would be highly acceptable is providing written testimony, either before or after the event. And we will also follow up with a RFI, request for information. That had seemed to serve as a very useful mechanism. After our consultation on the opioid epidemic, we received a really, really good detailed feedback after the consultation had occurred, and we were able to compile the list of recommendations. The subsequent recommendations that we received from the RFI were very, very sharp and very, very clear. So thanks.
Okay, great. And if someone is coming to the consultation, they have a letter from their tribal leader saying they're representing the tribe, who do they give that to?
So they could give that to anyone at the Tribal Health Research Office, and we would make sure that they had a seat at the table.
Great, thank you. All right, let's see. We still have time for a couple more, maybe two more questions, and then we'll end the webinar. So let's see. The next question is, if tribal law states that there is no data sharing, will there be financial limits to grants issued, as has been the case in the past?
Well, I can't address past issues because I'm not aware of those. But if there are tribal prohibitions against data sharing, we would expect when a researcher who is working with those tribal nations submitted their data sharing and management plan, they would clearly state that they would not be able to share data in accordance with tribal law or policy, and that would be part of their data sharing plan. That would be nothing that would be held against them for the purposes of getting a grant award.
But if a researcher gets an award, and then it's discovered that they have violated tribal law, what would happen then?
So they would face consequences, and their institution actually would potentially face consequences for violating any term and condition of our awards, which would certainly include comporting with all relevant laws, policies, regulations. So there would be consequences both for the investigator in their current and future potential for NIH funding, and potentially for the institution as well, depending on the magnitude of the violation.
Also, just a comment for me, I hope that NIH is updating all of their funding opportunity announcements with the common rule update that says must follow state, local, and tribal laws, because that's the new thing that was added in January. So I hope that's there. All right, the last question relates to the issue of individual tribal citizens who may want to participate in research versus the position of the tribe on research. So it says, is there an overall understanding at NIH that research with tribes is not based on race, but instead based on citizenship in sovereign tribal nations? Is there an understanding that American Indians are citizens and that tribes are governed under a presidential executive order and presidential memorandum that directs tribal consultations? This reinforces tribes as nations and not as stakeholders. Referencing, I think, the first slide. Also, please note that the individual tribal citizens do not represent the official position of the tribal nations. Individuals cannot waive the tribal sovereignty or the requirement for consultation into a government-to-government fashion. So the question is, does the NIH understand those principles?
Absolutely, and that's what we're trying to honor is the consultation process by engaging in this conversation very early on as we begin, as the Office of Science Policy begins to shape this policy moving forward. I think it's really important because if you have worked with tribal nations, you understand that their acknowledgement of jurisdiction varies vastly. Some bind or adhere to land-based jurisdictions, and many of the tribes that are not land-based do not confine themselves to jurisdictions within their tribal territories. So it's really important, depending upon which tribe you're talking about, if their definition of authority over tribal membership or citizenship is within, say, the boundaries of the Navajo Nation, or if it extends in all of wherever this person may be living or residing. And that varies. So it's really important to understand what are the current rules and regulations of that individual tribe before we begin conversations about violating tribal sovereignty in that way. And understanding that individuals who do sign up for specific research programs or projects have the opportunity to do that unless we are told otherwise by tribal nations.
All right, thank you. And so just to clarify, you're holding the consultations, and then by the end of the year, there should be draft policy and draft guidance. There'll be time to give input on that, and then there'll probably be more opportunity to see the close to final. And so these tribal consultations are obviously really important because it sounds like there is still opportunity to influence the outcome.
Absolutely, and that's why we strategically picked these specific areas, because we believe they cover a good section of the United States, and we still want to allow the opportunity for, again, written testimony to be submitted at any time. You know, we can get recommendations as early as now from the community or from the listening community out there. Those can be sent directly to the Tribal Health Research Office or to the Office of Science Policy directly.
Great, thank you. I remember when NIH first started talking about the data sharing issue, and it was expressed as like, people have to share their data and there's no flexibility. And I remember in the Native investigator community, there being a lot of angst about this and a lot of people really upset. So I think I feel hopeful that there's an opportunity here to influence the policy through the consultation process. And so we'll do what we can to help encourage people to attend the consultation sessions and give input, because it's really important that tribes have input on this as sovereign nations, and because they have research codes, and because there's, research can have great benefit in Indian communities, but there's also a very significant potential for harm. And as long as the protections are in place, I think people wouldn't mind data sharing, but it's making sure those protections are in place is really important. I'm checking to see if there's any last comments before we end.
I would just say in closing that I think, at the end of the day, from our perspective, responsible data sharing is all about maximizing the benefits of the data for all, and not about, we're not looking to alienate or discourage participation. So it's very helpful to hear how collectively we can make sure that we're developing a policy that allows that maximizing of benefits and putting those appropriate protections in place.
Great, thank you. Well, I see we're at the end of the hour, so I'd first like to thank our speakers from the National Institutes of Health for their very informative presentation and willingness to join us today. And I'd like to thank everybody else who joined us today, and don't forget to complete the evaluation that you will receive in the follow-up email after this webinar. And this webinar will be available as a recording soon on our YouTube page that you can access from our website, and we'll also send the link out on our Twitter account. Please feel free to send the link of the webinar to any of your colleagues, and especially all the tribes who may be interested in submitting comments and attending the consultation sessions. So just a couple announcements before we leave today. Watch for announcements on this webinar series. We try to do them monthly. We may have one or two more this month, so watch our Twitter feed or our website or our email listserv. If you're not on our listserv, email research@ncai.org and we can add you. We also have included our Twitter handle and website information on the slide. And save the date. Join us for the NCAI Midyear Conference and the 14th Annual Tribal Leaders Scholar Forum at the NCAI Midyear Conference in Reno or Sparks, Nevada in late June 2019. We have a really great agenda. It's already posted and we hope to see you all there. There will also be NIH consultation sessions at the NCAI Midyear Conference on Monday, June 24th, 2019. At 9 a.m. it starts with a consultation session on intellectual property rights and biomedical research. We had a webinar in March on that. And then at 11:30 the consultation on the NIH All of Us Research Program will be held. On Thursday, June 27th, we're also holding a training with our new Holding Space Toolkit and featuring the Tribal Research Future Game. You can find registration information for the NCAI Midyear Conference, and the agenda is available on the NCAI website, ncai.org, and our NCAI Policy Research Center website. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.